Max Carter scanned the crowd of aliens gathered in the vast arena, each a contestant or spectator at the Galactic Council's Predator Games. It was an event that, as a human, he was never meant to attend. The Council only invited apex predators, species with natural weapons like fangs, claws, and scales tougher than human body armor. But here he was, the token human, standing in the shadow of creatures that looked like they belonged in nightmares. The murmurs from the crowd were hard to ignore. Snatches of alien languages floated to his ears, but the universal tone of disdain was clear. Humans were soft. Weak. This game wasn't for them. Max had been a soldier on Earth, trained in strategy and survival. But here none of that seemed to matter. The aliens saw him as an amusement, a blip on their radar, something they could toy with before the real competition began. A voice echoed across the arena, sharp and metallic, announcing the first event, the Gauntlet. The announcer, a towering lizard-like species with glittering scales, spoke in a tone dripping with anticipation. Today, our brave competitors will navigate an obstacle course designed to separate the strong from the weak, the predators from the prey. The crowd erupted in cheers and guttural howls as the other contestants sized up their surroundings. Some stretched their clawed limbs, others flexed dense, armored bodies. Max felt their eyes on him, curious and amused. He ignored them and focused on the start line. This wasn't Earth, but he wasn't about to let anyone treat him as prey. A shrill blast cut through the noise and the contestants surged forward. Max kept pace, scanning the path ahead. The first obstacle was a mud pit filled with thick, bubbling sludge. Some of the competitors barely slowed, charging through with sheer muscle. Max took a different approach. Dropping low, he moved with quick, efficient steps, minimizing the resistance from the mud. He could hear the crowd's surprise. Clearly, they hadn't expected him to last this long. The next hurdle was a series of electrified wires hanging from above. The larger aliens tried to duck and weave, but a few missteps left scorch marks on their scales. Max, with his smaller frame, slipped through with ease. He felt a flicker of satisfaction but shoved it down. This was just the beginning. Ahead, an alien, a hulking creature with tusks and an extra set of arms, grunted in frustration as it tried to heave itself over a wall. Max's first instinct was to offer help, but he stopped himself. This wasn't Earth and this wasn't a cooperative game. Here, every gesture was a weakness to be exploited. Without hesitation, he leapt onto the wall, using the rough texture to propel himself up and over, landing with a roll on the other side. His lungs burned, but he pushed forward. He wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but he was efficient. Every movement was deliberate, every breath calculated. Behind him, he heard yelps of pain as others faltered on obstacles designed to test agility and resilience. As the final stretch came into view, Max felt the weight of the challenge pressing down on him. The last obstacle was a massive incline, slick with some oily substance and dotted with sharp, metallic spikes. A nearby contestant, a creature covered in thick scales, dug its claws into the incline and climbed with brutal speed. Max watched for a moment, calculating. Claws were an advantage, but he had something else. Ingenuity. Max pulled out a small strap from his belt and looped it around one of the spikes, using it to anchor himself as he climbed. It was slow, grueling work, but the method held. With each pull, he rose higher until finally, with one last heave, he scrambled over the top. A stunned silence hung over the arena as Max made it to the finish line. For a moment, it seemed as if no one could believe he was there. The crowd had expected him to fail, to collapse halfway through. But here he was, standing among the victors. The announcer's voice cut through the silence, laced with an edge of disbelief. Max Carter, human representative, has completed the gauntlet. Max glanced around. The other competitors eyed him warily now, a few of them clearly rethinking their initial dismissal. He allowed himself a small, grim smile. He wasn't here to prove anything to them, but if they wanted to underestimate him, that was their mistake. As the next event's preparations began, Max felt the weight of the challenge ahead. This was just the first round, and already he had drawn more attention than he'd wanted. But he'd come here to show that humanity wasn't just prey. Whatever happened next, he was ready. In the stands, a pair of narrow eyes watched him closely. The figure, tall, cloaked, and silent, nodded almost imperceptibly. The human was proving unexpected. Max Carter crouched low, hidden behind the thick, twisted roots of an alien tree. The air was heavy, humid, and filled with strange, distant howls. This was no ordinary jungle. It was a controlled environment created by the Galactic Council to test survival. Everything around him was engineered to be hostile. For the next 72 hours he would need to survive. They dropped him on this barren, resource-scarce planet with only a knife, a water canister, and a basic survival kit. The other contestants had similar supplies, but most of them also had natural advantages: fangs, claws, or hides that blended seamlessly with the jungle. Max had none of that. He only had his instincts and his training. He scanned the trees, alert for movement. The council's briefing had been clear. The planet was filled with native predators, each dangerous in its own way. But there was also another threat: the other contestants. While direct attacks were forbidden, ambushes and sabotage were encouraged to thin the competition. Max knew that any of these aliens would be happy to see him fail. A rustle nearby caught his attention. He froze, gripping his knife tightly. From the shadows emerged a tall, sinewy figure, Rakala, an alien predator known for her sharp reflexes and ruthless hunting skills. Her eyes glinted, sizing him up. Max didn't move. In these games, eye contact could signal either aggression or, at times, a temporary truce. To his surprise, Rakala nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement of his performance in the first event. "Human," she said in a low, growling voice, "you survived the gauntlet. Perhaps you're not as weak as they say." "Perhaps not," Max replied evenly, watching her warily. She glanced around, then crouched beside him, her gaze sharp. "A temporary alliance. The jungle here is unforgiving and the local creatures hunt in packs." Max hesitated. Teaming up wasn't forbidden, and an alliance would increase his chances of surviving. But he also knew she could turn on him if it suited her. Still, there was something about her calm, calculating demeanor that hinted at an understanding of trust, at least for now. "Agreed," he said. "We split resources and keep watch." They moved silently, scanning their surroundings for shelter and food. Max focused on survival basics: gathering water, starting a small fire with friction, and building a makeshift shelter. Rakala observed him, her predatory eyes narrowing. "Humans are creative," she said as he crafted a tool to dig for edible roots. "Creativity keeps us alive," he replied, setting the fire alight. The warmth was comforting, even under the intense stares of alien creatures lurking in the darkness. That night, a sudden shriek echoed through the jungle, followed by the rustle of something massive moving in their direction. Max and Rakala braced themselves as a predator, towering with rows of gleaming teeth, lunged from the shadows. Working in unison, they fought it off, Max landing precise strikes while Rakala used her claws to drive it back. The creature eventually retreated, injured and snarling. When the jungle fell silent again, Rakala looked at Max with something almost like respect. "You might survive this," she admitted. Max managed a small, tense smile. "That's the plan." Max stood in a stark, empty chamber, his reflection mirrored in the polished metal walls around him. This was the third event of the Predator Games, the Mind Games. Unlike the physical obstacles or the survival trials, this round was designed to test psychological resilience. Contestants would face their deepest fears, insecurities, and doubts, all simulated in this controlled chamber. The council's voice echoed overhead, explaining the event's rules. "Contestants, you will be subjected to illusions tailored to test your mental fortitude. Your goal is simple: remain in control. Those who succumb will be eliminated." Max took a deep breath, bracing himself as the room dimmed. In an instant he was no longer in the chamber. Instead, he stood on a deserted street on Earth, the gray, broken buildings looming around him. It was eerily quiet, unsettlingly familiar. He recognized the place, the site of an old mission that had ended in failure and the loss of several teammates. The memory gnawed at him, a wound he hadn't allowed himself to revisit. A soft voice whispered from behind him. He turned, and there, standing in the shadows, was his former squad. Their eyes were empty, accusing. "You left us, Max," one of them murmured, stepping forward, his face twisted with anger. "You failed us?" Max clenched his fist, steadying himself. He knew this wasn't real, knew these were only illusions crafted to exploit his fears. But their voices clawed at him, stoking the guilt he'd buried long ago. "Get out of my head," he whispered, but the voices grew louder, the illusions more vivid. He forced himself to focus. He knew he had to break through this, stay grounded in reality. Drawing on his training, he took deep breaths, grounding himself in the present. He reminded himself of the truth: he had done all he could in that mission, even if the outcome had been tragic. The illusion shifted abruptly. Now he was back in the jungle from the previous round, alone and vulnerable. Shadows loomed, creatures with hungry eyes closing in. As panic threatened to rise, he clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. "This isn't real," he muttered, repeating it like a mantra. "This isn't real." Suddenly the scene flickered and he saw Arcala, caught in her own illusion nearby. Her eyes were wide, body tense, trapped in a vision of her own making. She seemed frozen, her usual confidence shattered. Max approached her cautiously, understanding that the rules didn't prevent him from helping her. Arcala, he called out, his voice steady, it's an illusion. None of this is real. She blinked, his voice piercing her nightmare. Gradually, her breathing steadied and she looked at him, dazed but grateful. I didn't think humans could withstand this kind of trial. We're more resilient than you think, Max replied, offering her a nod of reassurance. Together they steeled themselves and pushed forward. The illusions continued to shift, trying to unnerve them, but they kept their minds anchored, breaking through each scenario with renewed determination. As the illusions faded, Max found himself back in the chamber, his heart pounding but his mind clear. Overhead, the council's voice spoke, barely masking its surprise. Max Carter, human representative, and Arcala have completed the mind games. Max exhaled, glancing at Arcala. For the first time, she looked at him with genuine respect. You're not like the others, she said quietly. Neither are you, he replied with a small smile. In this round he'd proven to himself, and to the others, that humanity's strength wasn't just in physical endurance, but in mental resilience. And he knew now that he wasn't facing these challenges alone. Max Carter tightened his grip on his makeshift spear, his eyes scanning the terrain of the last arena. This was the final round of the Predator Games, a brutal free-for-all, where every remaining contestant would battle until only one remained standing. No alliances, no mercy. Only one victor. He and Arcala shared a last look across the field. She inclined her head, a quiet acknowledgement of their alliance throughout the games. But now they were opponents, and both understood that the stakes left no room for hesitation. The signal blared and the final challenge began. Competitors scattered across the arena, and Max immediately took to the shadows, knowing his best chance lay in stealth and strategy. He couldn't match the raw power or physical defenses of the other aliens, but he'd learned that speed, cleverness, and unpredictability could be just as effective. A hulking beast with scales like steel prowled nearby, oblivious to Max's presence. Max sized it up, realizing a direct confrontation would be suicide. Instead, he quietly slipped away, setting up a trap. Using a few rocks and a rope from his survival kit, he rigged a simple tripwire, leading it to a patch of loose earth. When the creature lumbered forward, it triggered the trap and stumbled into a hidden pit Max had quickly dug. He moved on, conserving his energy. Soon, though, he was forced into a face-off with another predator, a razor-toothed creature with razor-sharp claws that lunged with incredible speed. Max dodged the attack, narrowly escaping as it slashed at him. Thinking quickly, he grabbed a nearby stick, wedging it between two rocks to form an improvised slingshot. Loading a jagged stone, he aimed and let it fly, striking the creature across the face and sending it reeling. Wounded, it retreated and Max pressed on, his muscles aching, his breath coming in short gasps. Each encounter was a calculated move, a test of every survival instinct he had. This was nothing like the simulated challenges back on Earth. Here one mistake could mean the end. And then there was only one left, Arcala. The two of them circled each other, weapons raised. She regarded him, her gaze unreadable. You fought well, human, she said. More than I ever expected. Likewise, he replied, both wary and respectful. For a moment they simply stood there, each gauging the other. Max knew she was stronger and faster, but he also knew he had a chance if he kept his movements unpredictable. He feinted left and she lunged, but he anticipated it, ducking and rolling to her side. She countered with a swipe of her claws, narrowly missing as he sidestepped. They fought in a flurry of movements, both matching skill with skill, each refusing to give in. But as the fight wore on, Max sensed a shift. Arcala hesitated, her eyes softening. Perhaps she saw, as he did, that this wasn't just about victory anymore. It was a mutual respect forged in struggle, an understanding between two warriors from different worlds. Finally, she lowered her weapon, nodding once. This is your victory, Max Carter. Take it. Stunned, Max hesitated, but he knew better than to question the honor she was offering. He raised his weapon, signaling his win. The council announced him as the victor, and a cheer rose, though muted with surprise. As he stood there, exhausted but triumphant, he realized that he'd done more than win the games. He'd changed the way they viewed humanity. Humans, they would remember, were not prey, they were survivors. And Max Carter had proven it beyond a doubt.